Good morning, everybody. Welcome back, and thank you so much for joining our session on the future of democracy assistance, in particular how the U.S. government can use this critical tool to support transitions from anti-American regimes to pro-U.S. governments. My name is Patrick Quirk. I have the pleasure of serving as senior advisor with the Atlantic Council's Freedom and Prosperity Center. This panel, in fact, is the formal launch of our paper series on the future of democracy assistance. So far, we've released briefs looking at each major geographic region, risks, recommendations, and will in the coming month or so release a policy brief with recommendations on a roadmap for American democracy assistance moving forward. So stay tuned for that. For this session, I'll offer a few framing points, introduce our esteemed panelists, and then get right into the discussion. Time permitting, we'll get to some questions from all of you as well. To kick us off then, President Trump has consistently, and I would say correctly, affirmed that U.S. actions overseas must directly benefit citizens here at home. Supporting democracies in developing countries passes this test because the U.S. and its people are more safe and prosperous in a world that's free and open. Therefore, supporting democracy, particularly in strategic locations, is not just an altruistic exercise. We, of course, can and very well should support freedom fighters, strong political institutions, because doing so aligns with American values. But the main reason we promote democracy through a combination of diplomacy, investment, and international assistance is because it's good for the United States, all of you here in this room and joining us online. This view is not based on anecdote or ideology, it's based on facts. Scores of data show that democracies are more reliable trading partners, less likely to go to war with one another, less likely to export terrorism, crime. They're also not sources of mass migration, like we've seen with people fleeing the repressive regime in, say, Nicaragua. Finally, democracy is good for business. Our indexes here at the Atlantic Council show that increases in political freedom are indistinguishably linked to growth of economies. Therefore, more democracy abroad is also good for American companies here at home. To that end, it is perhaps no surprise at all that many people across Venezuela, Iran, and the rest of the globe have celebrated the Trump administration's removal of anti-American leaders in Tehran and Caracas, and there are some signs that perhaps the regime in Cuba could be next. Removing despotic, violent leaders who suppress their people and call for the death of America could perhaps be a positive step forward for freedom, but the question is what comes next? In these and other cases, how can the U.S. use non-military tools, and in particular democracy assistance, to ensure stable transitions to pro-U.S. governments that deliver for the people in those countries? Thankfully, to help us answer these and other questions, we have two excellent panelists with decades of experience working on national security issues. To my immediate left, we have Melissa Ford Maldonado, who's the director of the Western Hemisphere Initiative at the America First Policy Institute. And to her left, we have Dr. Daniel Twining, who's the president of the International Republican Institute. For format, I'm going to ask 2 rounds of questions, and then time permitting, come out to all of you for your questions. For this first round, I want to start big picture in terms of ROI on supporting democracy as a core component of U.S. foreign policy. So Melissa, let's start with you. As someone who works on strategies for threats in this hemisphere in particular, you very well understand how we need military and non-kinetic tools to keep America safe, secure, and prosperous. So can you walk us through why democracy assistance is such a critical tool of U.S. foreign policy, and how does investing in democratic institutions and political actors deliver for American citizens here at home?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I love the way you phrased it. And the reason I love it is because I think it's really important oftentimes to take a step back and ask ourselves that question. Is it really in the American interest? And if so, why? And I think for us to understand that, we need to establish why the U.S. should care about Latin America. I think, I'm the director of the Western Hemisphere. Oftentimes we talk about the Americas, but that is still something that a lot of people don't understand. And it's a very simple reason why we should care about Latin America, and it is because of geography, right? The U.S. is kind of this center of gravity for the Western Hemisphere. What we do affects the rest of the hemisphere, but that also happens in reverse. So when we have a lot of countries, at least in our hemisphere, that are either struggling with something like oppressive regimes or brutal dictatorships or economic collapse or some sort of state cartel nexus with organized crime. All of those things eventually make their way up to the US through our southern border and result in American communities being affected, right? Whether that is through illegal immigration or drug trafficking or overdose deaths. And so that's why we need to care about Latin America. And what we often say at the America First Policy Institute is America First doesn't mean America alone, right? It's not a zero-sum game. We can invest in these countries because we want them to be free and prosperous and safe and stable, because that also means that we have neighbors that are not exporting chaos into our territory, and a stable hemisphere is better for all of us, right? So, like you said better security partners, better business partners. They're territories that are not breeding grounds for hostility or anti-American powers or corruption. So now that we've kind of established that, I do want to say I think democracy and supporting democracy around the globe, but I'll talk specifically about Latin America, is so important and it's so vital, but it cannot be our only goal, right? We also, as the United States, need to demand security, because there are so many cases that we've seen, for example, in Latin America, and I'll use Mexico as an example because I just came from there. But we have, a country, especially in the overlap that we had between President López Obrador and President Biden, we have a country that is democratic, where they elected a president that almost everybody loved and still loves, even though he's no longer in office. But the situation that we had then did not produce stability, neither for them or for the US. And he was elected into a country that was chaotic, didn't serve its own people very well, and eventually ended up affecting us here in the US in terms of kind of the worst, one of the worst humanitarian crises at the border, and not much cooperation between Mexico and the United States, right? And so I think it is important that we always have a focus on security, and a democratic end state is something that we absolutely want, but it can't be the only goal. We have to demand security, full stop. And then one more thing I'll add to that is I think it's really important to kind of play the long game, right? We need to be patient and we need to be consistent. Because the reality is, for example, in places like Cuba, that after 67 years, they're still under the heel of one of the most brutal dictatorships on the planet. And examples like Cuba, I don't think that it is realistic to assume that democratic civics is just going to reemerge and persist, right? And even in countries where that has happened, like Argentina detransitioned out of a dictatorship, but they had a terrible time at it. And they are still dealing with a lot of the repercussions from that, whether that be economic issues or hyperinflation or kind of cycles of instability and populism. So it's important that we do everything that we can to promote democracy, but that needs to be also met with some preconditions.
Yeah, great point. In particular, that democracy can't be the only goal, but indeed, especially in this hemisphere, helps enable other core foreign policy priorities of the U.S. So Dan, let's stay big picture. Where, in your view, has democracy support resulted in big wins for the American taxpayer? And if we look at some of the most pressing foreign policy challenges today, like Iran, how can we advise the White House to best use democracy assistance to realize those priorities?
Thanks, Patrick. I'm so pleased to be here with you. The Freedom and Prosperity Center is doing fabulous work. Thanks for your leadership here as part of that. So a couple things. One, if you think about the national security challenge set that we confront in the world, really all of our fundamental national security challenges emanate from hostile great power autocracies, authoritarian aggression out of places like Russia, China, and Iran, or dictatorships in our own hemisphere, failed states, right? We have experienced extraordinary mass migration out of broken countries like Syria and Venezuela. We have experienced the biggest wars in Europe and the Middle East really in my lifetime, and the threat of Chinese aggression looming over East Asia, which grows in intensity. Democracy assistance is one tool in the toolkit, right? 99% of the time, we do not want to use the military instrument. How can we use our entire toolkit to advance the kind of objectives that secure America and the Americas, but that also uphold what Secretary Lando talked about very compellingly this morning, American economic leadership in the world? In fact, American businesses and investors do not succeed in countries that are grossly corrupt, that are authoritarian, that are kleptocratic, that are hostile to us. Where institutions and rule of law and competitive politics hold, our companies do better, and we advance a prosperity agenda. So I would take his remarks one step farther and tie our economic prosperity agenda to good governance in the world. American democracy assistance has succeeded. I think we sort of lose sight of the transformation of the world since I was a young man watching the end of the Cold War. Some of our best allies in the world were on the other side of the fight with the Soviet Union. Some of our best allies in the world are in the former Soviet Empire. Those countries have become security providers. Gosh, look at Ukraine, helping us very directly with conflict in the Middle East to defend against Iranian aggression. US democracy assistance helps mitigate national security threats. It helps advance a prosperity agenda that redounds directly to the benefit of Americans. It produces a more peaceful and stable world. And yes, Mexico is a great example of deep democratic deficits, right? I think sometimes we blame democracy when what we should be blaming is the fact that democracy is not functioning and delivering justly and well. Where we can help it work better with very small investments, we secure extraordinary returns.
So shifting from that higher level ROI strategy view to more tactical country specific, for this round, let's unpack how democracy support can help with some transitions from anti-American regimes to pro-US governments, starting here in our own hemisphere, Melissa. So in your view, what does success look like in Venezuela in the next year, 18 months? And how can the US use some of this targeted time-bound democracy assistance to realize that end state?
That's a great question. And I think there's two answers to that. So from the US perspective, I think you can make the argument that success has already been achieved for us, right? We removed a hostile regime, we reestablished influence, and right now we maintain control of all of their major commodities and the foreign affairs of Venezuela. So I think it's important to realize that even if not a single thing more was done, for the US, that's considered a success, right? But I think now to me, I don't think that declaring victory right now and walking away would be prudent. And thankfully, we have an administration right now that realizes that, and a Secretary of State that knows that America is a great country, not just a good one, and we need to make sure that all of the work that was put into the liberation of Venezuela is not in vain, right? And so I think there are a few things that still need to happen. You gave me a timeline of like a year, 18 months. A lot has been done. A lot still has to be done. But I think that the end state in that timeline where we could say that the situation in Venezuela is a success, not just for us, but also for the Venezuelan people, is we want to see a Venezuela that is fully sovereign, that has restored order, services, political legitimacy, and has kind of reincorporated itself not just with the US, but with the democratic world, and is somehow incorporated into a US-led security framework. I think that would be a success. And there's a few different things that need to pan out for that to happen. I think number one, we need to ensure basic stability. That is, are the streets safe? Are the ports functioning? Is the energy flowing? Are we continuing to tackle these kind of cartel links? And then we need political legitimacy. And I think for that, and there's still some work to be done here, but for that we need for the Venezuelan people to feel ownership over the process that they're going through democratically, not just feel like it was something that was imposed on them. And then we also need a robust civil society and a strong opposition force. Finally, I think geopolitically, we need to ensure that there is that geopolitical realignment, make sure that Venezuela doesn't slide back into and under the influence of a lot of hostile extra-hemispheric powers, whether that be China or Iran or Russia. And we just need to continue rebuilding institutions. So whether that's the judiciary or election administration or a strong free media or anti-corruption mechanisms, that's another step that we need to take. So I think we are headed in the right direction. I think a lot of that has already been achieved. But we have to continue kind of treading the lines on a lot of those issues to make sure that's going in the right direction.
So initial successes, but more work to be done to ensure that, for example, Venezuela doesn't end up back in a place which kind of forced the U.S. to invade in the first place.
Exactly.
A repressive regime, pushing migrants out, trafficking drugs, et cetera. Dan, sticking with Venezuela, if we take it down to even a more tactical level, with a potential for a democratic opening for the first time in years, what, in your view, are some of the most pressing needs on the ground, and how could U.S. democracy assistance help meet those?
So Venezuela, as you all know, was the richest country in South America until it was broken by horrible governance. Not war, not terrorism, not natural disaster. I don't need to tell this room. It's an example of malgovernance destroying a country, a quarter of the population left. Rebuilding it will be an extraordinary effort. We're very lucky that there is a democratic and civic infrastructure in Venezuela, thanks mainly to courageous Venezuelans, but frankly, thanks also to U.S. democracy assistance to those actors over many, many years. That includes not just leaders and parties and organizations, it includes independent media, for instance, that still stay in the fight and are part of a transformation. So what does Venezuela need? The good news is Venezuela, there is a democratic history there. There are democratic institutions that are latent that can be revived. The opposition is unified and organized. There is an effective coalition which we know would win a legitimate election. We also know very clearly where the Venezuelan people are. They are not voting or interested in the continuation of authoritarianism and poverty and dysfunction. So Venezuela needs support for political organizing. It needs support for actors to campaign and then obviously to govern justly, to rebuild institutions. We get very focused on leaders. I mean, there is this extraordinary turn in Latin America with all these pro-American leaders coming to office, but they are dealing with tough, tough legacies. Venezuela, perhaps the toughest, but also think about Bolivia or Ecuador or Argentina or Honduras or many other countries that have recently transitioned. Venezuela has the advantage of an amazing natural resource base. Those resources have been funding a kleptocratic authoritarian state. Those resources will need to be re-engineered to fund democratic infrastructure and democratic institutions, including an effective parliament, including effective courts. And American investment will not succeed in this country, I would argue, unless we can make sure that that transition succeeds, that American companies and investors and businesses know that they have sanctity and rule of law and property rights, and that their business is not dependent on the whim of an authoritarian.
Yep. Need to make sure that Venezuela is investable, that companies actually want to inject capital. So we have 10 minutes left before we come to the audience and then online for questions. One final one for me for this group, and let's focus on scenarios for Cuba. So Melissa, the U.S., as you know, has long maintained pressure on the Cuban regime. How do we make the case that sustained pressure still serves a strategic purpose, and how can the U.S. Support a transition, but ensure that it doesn't just lead to regime adaptation, but true regime formation?
That's a great question. So I think for Cuba, specifically as far as the interest that the United States has there, I don't think the sole interest is to see like a democratic change necessarily in Cuba for the U.S., but I think the main interest that the U.S. has is ensuring that our national security is protected, right? And that it is no longer exporting chaos onto our shores, or that it doesn't continue being this hub of instability for the entire hemisphere. I mean, Cuba is this breeding ground for a lot of bad things that make their way into the U.S., and it's only like 90 miles. It's like 90 miles from Florida, right? And so that's a big national security threat to the U.S. And I think that that is the main thing that needs to be addressed. They're a breeding ground for Hamas, for Hezbollah, and they're very deeply aligned with a lot of anti-American powers. And so that is something that the U.S. definitely wants to see addressed. And I think right now, one thing that we know is that the regime is more fragile than it's ever been. And in large part, that is thank you to the U.S. That is in large part because they are no longer receiving oil shipments or oil subsidies from Venezuela. And another reason is because they're no longer receiving that from Mexico either, which was a big provider of that. And that's thanks to U.S. pressure. So I think we're closer than we've ever been. I think you're 100% right when you say that the real threat is regime adaptation. For a lot of us that are in the Latin American space or from Latin America, we've seen it time and time again. I mean, coming from Bolivia, I can tell you it was 20 years of being promised something new, a different leader, somebody that would make real change, just to suddenly have kind of the same face, the same process under a new face. And I often like to compare it to a house. Like it's almost governance in a lot of countries in Latin America is like a house that's falling apart. Like the roof is coming off, the foundations are unstable, the wiring is faulty, and then we have someone come in that promises you a ton of things, and then really what they give you is kind of a fresh coat of paint, right? And so we've seen that in Bolivia. That's what happened, for example, in Nicaragua with the Sandinistas, where we had this like revolutionary leadership basically just adapt and continue to oppress the people there. And so I think we need to be really careful that that doesn't happen in Cuba. And what's tough about Cuba is we don't have a great example. There's nothing close to it. I mean, they've been under the heel of this dictatorship for 67 years. It is not the same as Venezuela. It's very different. It's much more closed. We have a regime that has been working tirelessly for almost 7 decades, making sure that there is no opposition force that is equipped enough to take over. And so what we need to see there is we need to make sure that there is this reemergence of a strong civil society and many leaders, not just one leader, right? That model of one charismatic leader has failed the people of Cuba. So we need to see a lot of strong institutions. We need to see a lot of strong leadership. And what the U.S. needs to do is not just, support the fall of this next regime, but we need to support and make sure that we have the pillars in place for it to be successful and sustainable.
So extending that a bit further, Dan, looking at what those pillars might be, walk us through what you think day one of a Cuban transition might look like and what U.S. investments in civil society, political actors are most critical to shaping that outcome.
Thanks, Patrick. I mean, you're an expert in this, but just for some of the audience maybe watching online, a transition doesn't mean you go from autocracy to democracy. What a transition does is begin to open political space. And then the question is who fills it, right? So your point about bad actors filling it and you get something that looks like, quote, regime change, but it's just a reshuffling of the deck chairs. So that's what we don't want to see in Cuba. As political space opens, we want to see democratic political actors fill it. That means they have to be able to organize. That means they have to be able to campaign. That means they have to ultimately be able to run for elections and govern in representative ways. We want to see civil society step up. I mean, part of a communist totalitarian system is basically making the state so dominant that there is no society or it's just shriveled. Civil society has a big role to play. Government cannot solve all problems in our country or in a broken country like Cuba. So there will be a big role for civic actors in dealing with just some of the most basic forms of local governance and administration. The ability of free media is always a good canary in the coal mine. Can media actually report on what is happening freely so that citizens can understand how new and emergent leaders are addressing concerns? There are going to be so many needs. But this big, I think the big question for us is we never know when these transitions are going to happen. Sometimes they take a very long time. Sometimes they happen like this. Small investments in assistance to political and civic actors in these countries ready the playing field so that when there is an opening, there are democratic actors who can capably fill it, and you don't just get chaos and mass migration, which is another alternative. You don't just necessarily have a transition that moves either into a new form of autocracy or towards democracy. You can also just get a form of anarchy where there's effectively just absent government, absent governance, and we certainly don't want to see that given that we're right offshore.
So recognizing we have just about 3.5 minutes left, I'm going to take the prerogative of moderator to make the final question for both Melissa and Dan for your final reflections. So both of you, if you were to identify one pressing foreign policy challenge, either in this hemisphere or globally, which one is best suited for democracy assistance to help solve, and why?
So I would like to say, I just think it's very important for us to support frontline democracies. There are very brave frontline democracies, not just like Ukraine, but like Moldova and Armenia, who are standing up to Putin's attempt to basically recreate the Soviet empire. We should support them because we have a fundamental geopolitical interest in not letting Putin succeed in recreating the Soviet empire. There are frontline democracies like Taiwan that are doing amazing work building their own democratic resilience, right? Also building extraordinary prosperity. Some of the greatest stories in the world. We should support them because, gosh, we really have an interest in an Asia that is free and pluralistic, including free for the people of Taiwan to chart their own course. So supporting frontline democracies is pretty fundamental. The other thing is, frankly, breaking up this axis of autocracies. We haven't really talked about it. We've alluded to some of the authoritarian collaboration. But it bothers me when democracies, when free societies do not work together because our authoritarian adversaries support each other very, very, very actively. It's one reason the Maduro regime survived so long in Venezuela. It's one reason the Castro regime has survived so long in Cuba. So let's make sure that we are helping our friends and supporting them so that they can carry the load for us in building free societies that become great trade and security partners to us. I think this is just fundamental. And by the way, I think we're winning. In Latin America, we are winning on this front. It's not all lost and bleak. We just need a little more of that.
And I would just agree with everything that you just said. Amen to that. But I do think that it's important to kind of continue driving home the point that it's very important for us as the United States to really focus on Latin America, right? There's been so much neglect for our neighbors in our own hemisphere for so long, and we have ignored them, I think, at our own peril. So just continuing to fight, like you said, I think a lot of this coalition of authoritarian leaders and dictators that we've had there, they're very organized. And they work very well together, and that's something that we haven't really done, and we are taking the first steps towards doing that and just making sure that we have a strong coalition of countries in our hemisphere that also, that want to be free, that want to be accountable, that want to be, responsible for what happens to their people. And I think that the U.S. really needs to double down. I know that there are a lot of engagements that we're involved in around the globe, especially right now. But the U.S. is capable of maintaining all of those engagements while still keeping a very important focus on what's happening within our neighborhood.
In part because there's an extraordinary opportunity for us if we succeed.
Absolutely.
So we should not lose sight of the opportunity. I totally agree.
Well, thanks to both of you. I think a through line through those comments and the panel more broadly is that the U.S., no surprise to people in this room, faces a multiplicity of challenges, and we're not going to solve, frankly, any of them unless U.S. foreign policy has support for freedom and democracy as a core pillar. Thanks so much again to Melissa and Dan for joining us. Thanks to all of you for being here. On to the next panel.
All right. Thanks, Patrick.
Thank you.